Dismissive avoidance can be incredibly difficult to understand. One moment they seem completely detached, and the next, you may find yourself wondering what is actually happening beneath the surface. But what happens when they eventually recognize something they never expected, that they didn't just hurt you, but that you've genuinely moved forward without them? Do they regret how they behaved? Do they start questioning the way they handled the relationship? Does seeing you move on force them to look back at the things they did, or failed to do, and reconsider their choices? That is exactly what we're going to unpack today. Not so you can sit around waiting for an avoidant person to regret losing you, but so you can understand the dynamic, stop questioning yourself, and continue moving forward while honoring your emotions, your needs, and the lessons this relationship was meant to teach you. Let's start with something extremely important. A lot of the time, a dismissive avoidant can hurt someone deeply and then behave as though absolutely nothing happened. And this can be incredibly confusing for the person on the receiving end. You may think, how can they act so normal after what they just did? Do they seriously not realize how much that affected me? Sometimes the answer is that they genuinely don't. Here's why. People with a dismissive avoidant attachment pattern are often much more sensitive to words than they are to certain behaviors. Criticism, being told they did something wrong, or feeling judged can hit them extremely hard because it can activate a deeper internal belief such as, something is wrong with me, I'm not good enough, or I'm fundamentally flawed. That sense of shame can become especially powerful inside intimate relationships. So when they feel criticized or confronted, their instinct may be to withdraw, shut down, become emotionally distant, or create space between themselves and the other person. However, actions and inactions can affect different attachment styles in very different ways. Someone with an anxious attachment style, for example, may become deeply distressed if their partner promises to call them back within an hour and then disappears until the following day. A fearful avoidant may also interpret that behavior as rejection, abandonment, or evidence that something is wrong in the relationship. But a dismissive avoidant may experience the exact same situation completely differently. Instead of thinking, why didn't they call me? Do they still care about me? They may think, oh, I don't have to talk on the phone tonight, that's actually fine. And this difference in emotional interpretation is extremely important, because if something doesn't personally hurt you, you don't always recognize that the exact same behavior could be painful for somebody else. As human beings, we naturally interpret other people's experiences through our own emotional framework. We assume that what would hurt us would hurt them, and what wouldn't bother us probably won't bother them either. That creates a major disconnect in relationships. A dismissive avoidant may genuinely believe that giving you space is harmless because, from their perspective, space feels comfortable. They may not understand that their silence, emotional withdrawal, lack of communication, broken promises, or absence could make their partner feel rejected or unimportant. So you can end up in a situation where one person is thinking, I didn't do anything wrong, while the other person is thinking, how could you possibly not realize what you did? And that misunderstanding can continue for a very long time. But there is another reason a dismissive avoidant may hurt you and then behave as though nothing happened. They can have a profound difficulty dealing with conflict. Now, when I say they are afraid of conflict, I don't necessarily mean they are sitting there terrified every time an argument begins. It isn't always obvious fear. Sometimes it looks more like emotional shutdown, avoidance, confusion, detachment, or an inability to know what to say. Underneath that reaction, however, there can be a powerful sense of learned helplessness. They may feel as though there is no way to handle the situation correctly. They worry that whatever they say will make things worse. They don't know how to communicate their emotions effectively. They may fear being blamed, criticized, misunderstood, or pulled into an emotionally intense conversation that they don't feel equipped to manage. So instead of engaging with the conflict, they may simply disappear from it. They withdraw, they stop communicating, they minimize what happened, they act normal, and from the outside, this can look incredibly cold, or even deliberately disrespectful. But internally, their experience may be much more complicated. Their nervous system may have learned that emotional closeness, confrontation, and vulnerability are situations where withdrawing feels safer than staying present, and that is where you need to be careful. Understanding why someone behaves this way does not mean you have to excuse the behavior. You can recognize that their attachment pattern may explain their reaction while still acknowledging that their actions hurt you. You can have compassion for their wounds without abandoning your own needs. And most importantly, you don't need them to fully understand the damage they caused before you give yourself permission to move forward. Because sometimes the biggest shift happens when they finally realize that you're no longer standing in the same place, waiting for them to change. You've stopped chasing, you've stopped explaining, you've stopped trying to convince them to understand your feelings. You've started choosing yourself. And when they eventually notice that you've genuinely moved on, that can force them to confront something they were previously able to avoid, the reality that their behavior had consequences. That doesn't automatically mean they will admit everything, apologize, or suddenly become emotionally available. But it can create an internal realization that wasn't there before. They may begin replaying certain moments. They may wonder whether they handled things differently. They may remember conversations they dismissed. They may recognize that the person who once kept reaching toward them is no longer reaching at all. And sometimes that is when regret begins, not necessarily because they suddenly understand every mistake, but because your absence removes the emotional safety net they had become accustomed to. Your moving forward becomes evidence that the relationship was not permanently waiting for them. And that realization can be uncomfortable. But remember, your healing should never depend on whether they experience that discomfort. The real goal is not to make a dismissive, avoidant regret losing you. The real goal is to understand what happened, learn what the relationship revealed about your own patterns and needs, and make different choices moving forward. Because closure does not always come from the other person finally explaining themselves. Sometimes closure comes from no longer needing the explanation. They can become frightened by their own ability to handle the situation. They may doubt whether they are capable of staying present, communicating clearly, or navigating the disagreement in a healthy way. Instead of moving toward the conflict, they can slip into a kind of freeze response, and from your perspective, that can feel exactly like being stonewalled, ignored, or deliberately shut out. Now, can a dismissive avoidant intentionally give you the silent treatment to punish you? Absolutely, that is possible. Any person, regardless of attachment style, can use withdrawal as a way to hurt or control someone. But generally speaking, dismissive avoidants aren't particularly driven by vindictiveness. They're not usually thinking, "You hurt me, so I'm going to make sure you hurt too." Of course, individual behavior varies, and attachment style doesn't prevent someone from behaving poorly. But this kind of deliberate retaliation tends to be less characteristic of the dismissive pattern. What can be much more common is a lack of awareness about the effect their behavior is having. They might genuinely think, "It's not a big deal, I just need some space." But they may not understand what that space feels like for the person on the other side. You may be sitting there wondering what is happening, whether they're angry, whether the relationship is okay, whether they're going to come back, or whether you've somehow ruined everything. Their attempt to regulate themselves can therefore create enormous uncertainty and anxiety for their partner. That's the second major reason they can hurt you and then behave as though nothing happened. The third reason is that they may not know how to take responsibility for their part in the situation. And honestly, this is one of the biggest issues to pay attention to when evaluating the long-term health of any relationship. Healthy relationships require the ability to communicate through conflict. You don't have to be perfect at it. You don't have to enjoy difficult conversations, but you have to be willing to participate in them. Securely attached people generally become better at this because they understand that conflict isn't automatically a threat to the relationship. It's an opportunity to understand one another, repair damage, and create a healthier dynamic. For someone with an insecure attachment pattern, however, taking ownership can feel much more threatening. They might unconsciously interpret admitting a mistake as, "I'm a bad person, I'm defective," or, "If I admit I did something wrong, I'll be rejected." So rather than saying, "I understand why that hurt you, and I can see where I contributed," they may avoid the conversation completely. They may disappear from the discussion because acknowledging their behavior requires vulnerability, and this is something you should pay attention to regardless of someone's attachment style. There are plenty of dismissive avoidants who are capable of showing up, taking accountability, doing their own work, and having healthy relationships. The attachment style itself isn't the problem. The problem is when someone refuses to grow. If a person cannot acknowledge their impact, cannot have uncomfortable conversations, refuses to take responsibility, and consistently ignores your needs, then eventually that behavior is going to affect the stability and longevity of the relationship. So what should you do if you're anxious or fearful avoidant and you're hurt by a dismissive avoidant who doesn't seem to recognize what happened? Let's begin with an anxious attachment pattern. If you're anxious and you've been hurt, I know one of your strongest impulses may be to stay quiet. You might think, it's okay, I'll let it go. I don't want to create another problem. I don't want them to leave. I just want us to get back to normal. But suppressing what happened doesn't actually make the hurt disappear. When you repeatedly silence yourself instead of communicating your needs, the unresolved emotion tends to resurface later as anxiety. You may initially convince yourself that everything is fine, but underneath that, your mind is still asking questions. Do they actually care about me? Do they even realize they hurt me? Why didn't they acknowledge what happened? Does my experience matter to them? And because those questions never received an answer, your nervous system remains uncertain. That uncertainty can eventually create what I would call a boomerang effect. You push your feelings down today, and then several days or even weeks later, you suddenly need more reassurance. You become more clingy. You seek more contact. You start checking whether they're still emotionally available. Not necessarily because something new happened, but because the original issue was never resolved. So instead of disappearing into self-silencing, practice expressing the actual issue. You could say something like, I know there's been some tension between us, and I don't think either of us enjoys that. I'd really like to understand how you're experiencing this from your side. I also want to explain what I need so that we can move forward. Then be specific. Don't simply say, I need you to care more. Tell them what caring would actually look like. Maybe you need reassurance. Maybe you need them to acknowledge that their behavior affected you. Maybe you need them to say, I care about you, I'm here, and I'll be more mindful of this going forward. Whatever the need is, put it into words. Think of it as painting a clear picture of what resolution would look like and then handing that picture to the other person. That makes it much easier for a dismissive avoidant to understand what you're actually asking for. And this is where many dismissive avoidants can do surprisingly well when communication is calm, direct, specific, and free from personal attacks. They may struggle with criticism and emotional chaos, but that doesn't mean they are incapable of responding to a clearly communicated need. If they don't respond perfectly, you can become even more specific. Instead of saying, I need reassurance, you might say, for me, reassurance would mean hearing that you care about me, that you're still here, and that you'll keep this in mind so we don't repeat the same situation. Now the other person doesn't have to guess what you're asking for. You've clearly communicated the need. And if they consistently refuse to meet it, after you've communicated calmly, clearly, and repeatedly, then the issue is no longer simply attachment style. At that point, you're looking at a person who isn't willing to participate in the relationship. And that would be unhealthy regardless of whether they're anxious, avoidant, fearful avoidant, or securely attached. Now let's talk about the fearful avoidant. If you're fearful avoidant and you feel deeply hurt in this dynamic, your first impulse may be very different. You may want to react. Fearful avoidants can experience hurt and quickly move into anger. That anger can become the protective emotion covering the vulnerability underneath it. You get hurt, then you get angry. You become harsh. You say things you later regret, or you suddenly decide, fine, if you don't care about me, I don't care about you either, and then you retreat. You shut the door emotionally. You become extremely cold. Dismissive avoidants may maintain emotional walls as a general pattern, whereas a fearful avoidant can sometimes create an incredibly intense wall after being triggered. Everything suddenly becomes, I'm done, don't talk to me, I don't need you. But underneath that reaction may be enormous hurt and fear. So if you notice yourself getting emotionally flooded and feeling an overwhelming need to react, don't immediately act on the emotion. Pause first. One useful practice is somatic processing, learning to notice what is happening inside your body and allowing yourself to experience the emotion without immediately becoming controlled by it. Think about what happens when you're extremely angry or hurt. In the moment, the emotion can feel like it has completely taken over. Then later, once the intensity passes, you may look back and think, Why did I react that way? That's an important signal. Your emotion temporarily became stronger than your ability to observe it. But here's the key. You cannot fully observe an experience and be completely consumed by it at the exact same moment. When you become the observer of the emotion instead of immediately acting from it, you create a small but incredibly important space between what you feel and what you do. And that space is where healthier choices begin. When an emotion completely takes over, you're no longer simply experiencing the emotion. You feel like you have become it. That's the difference between being consumed by something and actually witnessing it. Think about something as simple as a pen. If I can see the pen in front of me, I know that I am not the pen. There is a clear separation between me and the object I'm observing. The same principle can apply to emotions. When you're able to notice an emotion instead of immediately becoming consumed by it, you create psychological space between yourself and the experience. You're still fully aware of what you're feeling, but you're no longer completely controlled by it. There has actually been research exploring what happens inside the brain when people become emotionally triggered. In studies involving brain imaging, participants were asked to recall experiences that made them feel intense emotions, such as anger or emotional pain. When people became highly activated, brain activity shifted away from regions associated with more deliberate reasoning and higher-level thinking, including the prefrontal cortex, and toward more primitive threat response systems involved in fight or flight reactions. In other words, when you're deeply triggered, your ability to calmly analyze the situation can become much harder to access. But research has also found something fascinating. When people were instructed to simply observe and label what they were experiencing, their brain activity began shifting back toward those higher-level regions. Instead of simply thinking, "I'm furious," they were encouraged to identify the emotion and notice how it appeared physically. For example, "I feel angry. My arms feel hot. My chest feels tight. My jaw is tense." That's what we mean by somatic awareness. Somatic simply means relating to the body. You're not trying to argue with the emotion. You're not trying to make it disappear. You're simply noticing what is happening inside your body and putting words to the experience. And that small act of observation can create enough distance for you to think more clearly and reconnect with the part of yourself that can make intentional decisions. This is particularly important for people with a fearful avoidant attachment pattern. Fearful avoidance can sometimes experience emotions with tremendous intensity. When they feel rejected, hurt, abandoned, or threatened, there can be an immediate impulse to defend themselves. You may want to push the other person away. You may want to attack verbally. You may suddenly feel like you need to protect yourself at all costs. But here's the problem. When you're responding directly from that emotional state, you're not necessarily responding from your deepest needs. You're responding from the part of your nervous system that believes it needs immediate protection. Imagine that you're extremely frustrated with your boss because they constantly dump work on you at the last minute. If someone asks, "What do you need right now?" your emotionally activated brain might respond, "I need to destroy everything in my boss's office." Obviously, that's an exaggerated example, but it illustrates the point. Once you've created some emotional distance and regulated yourself, your actual need may become much clearer. I need to establish a boundary with my boss so they stop giving me unreasonable last-minute work. Those are two completely different responses. The first comes from emotional activation, the second comes from reflection and regulation. That's why regulating yourself before entering a difficult conversation is such an important part of healing an insecure attachment pattern. So if you're fearful avoidant, here's something simple I want you to practice. The next time you notice a powerful emotion rising, don't immediately act on it. Pause. Name the emotion. Then identify one or two physical sensations that accompany it. You might say, "I'm hurt and I feel a heaviness in my chest. I'm angry and my face feels hot. I'm afraid and my stomach feels tight." That's it. You're learning to stay present with the emotion instead of immediately escaping from it or allowing it to dictate your behavior. And this distinction is extremely important because many of us have learned to escape uncomfortable emotions altogether. We drink, we binge-watch television, we play video games for hours, we endlessly scroll social media, we overeat, we find anything that allows us to stop feeling what we're feeling. There is nothing inherently wrong with taking a break or distracting yourself sometimes. But using distraction specifically to avoid experiencing an emotion is very different from processing it. Somatic processing isn't about numbing yourself. It's almost the opposite. You're deliberately becoming more present with what's happening inside your body. You sit with the sensations, you notice them, you label them, and you allow them to exist without immediately reacting. Try staying with those sensations for a minute or two. At first, they may feel incredibly intense. You might think, I can't handle this. But emotions are constantly changing experiences. They aren't permanent states. They're experienced through sensations in the body, influenced by what your mind is interpreting and responding to. When you stop fighting the sensation and simply observe it, the intensity will often begin to shift. You may notice the tightness loosening, the heat beginning to fade, your breathing becoming slower, your body gradually settling. That process is what we're talking about when we refer to somatic processing. And there are certainly more advanced ways to work with emotional regulation, but even this basic practice can make a significant difference. Once you're regulated, you can return to the communication strategy we discussed with anxious attachment. Now you can say, this hurt me. Here's specifically how it affected me, and here's what I need going forward. Don't leave the other person guessing. Paint a clear picture of what meeting your need actually looks like. The goal isn't to suppress your emotions so you can have a perfect conversation. The goal is to experience the emotion, understand it, regulate yourself, and then communicate from a place where your actual needs can be heard. Because when you're completely overwhelmed, you're much more likely to communicate from fear, anger, or self-protection. When you're regulated, you have a much better chance of communicating from clarity, and that gives the other person a real opportunity to understand you, respond to you, and potentially meet the need you're expressing. So if you're working on healing a fearful avoidant attachment pattern, start here. Notice the emotion, name the emotion, notice the sensation, give yourself space, regulate, then communicate the need. You don't have to become emotionless. You don't have to stop yourself from feeling deeply. You simply need to learn that feeling something intensely doesn't mean you have to immediately act from it. That's where real emotional freedom begins. I hope this helped make the process clearer for you. If you have questions or want to share your own experience, leave it in the comments. And if you found this helpful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Avoidant for more content like this. I'll see you in the next video.